Spot the difference. On the left, Aleppo, Syria, 5 years ago. On the right, Bakhmut, Ukraine, this year. And spot the difference. Bashar al-Assad of Syria, Vladimir Putin of Russia. Today, at summits around the world, a tale of two tyrants, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. First up, the Arab League summit, Saudi Arabia. Assad invited to attend for the first time in 12 years. It was a giant leap on the road to his rehabilitation regionally. Greeted by another man carving out a new role for himself as bridge builder, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. Assad's star turn at the summit eclipsed by President Zelensky's surprise arrival. After his run of visits to European capitals ahead of an anticipated counter-offensive, this was a tougher crowd. Many oil-rich members of the Arab League have avoided picking a side in the war on Ukraine. Assad, of course, has picked a side. His survival compliments of Russian military support in Syria, the same military now killing Ukrainian civilians. So Zelensky wasn't pulling his punches.
I'm sure that we can all be united in saving people from the cages of Russian prisons. Unfortunately, there are some in the world and here among you who turn a blind eye to those cages and illegal annexations. And I'm here so that everyone can take an honest look, no matter how hard the Russians try to influence.
Zelensky's presence here an effort to build the broadest possible coalition of support globally. He knows it's not just about preaching to the converted. That's expected later in the week. He will join the G7 summit in Japan on Sunday, the furthest he's travelled from Kyiv since the full-scale invasion. And today, G7 leaders were at the Peace Memorial Park, Hiroshima, the place which marked the beginning of the end of another war. The headlines from the summit so far. President Biden announced US support for the training of Ukrainian pilots on fighter aircrafts like F-16s, training that will begin in the coming weeks. And Rishi Sunak outlined plans for a ban on imports of Russian diamonds. There were also measures around deterring third parties, both companies and countries, from helping Russia to evade the sanctions regime. As for Putin himself, business as usual today of sorts, patched into a Zoom call of the Russian Council on Inter-Ethnic Relations. He will have noted, though, the presence of his ally Assad back in the regional fold 12 years on, and may perhaps wonder to himself whether this group of Western leaders have the resolve, have the longevity to resist his own eventual return to their summit table.
Well, earlier I spoke to Alistair Burt, who was the UK's Middle East Minister for much of the time the Syrian civil war was raging. And I began by asking him whether Assad's appearance will give reassurance to Vladimir Putin.
It's a cruel truth. If you can survive and wear others down, then there is a chance that you will end up in a situation of being more able to dictate terms than others. But let me return to the situation in Syria itself. What's happening at the moment is Syria is badly divided. Turkey is occupying areas of the north. Millions of people have been displaced and removed. They need to go back, and those countries want them to go back. How can they go back to a Syria which is still in dire need of reconstruction and the like? That's the thinking. Then there is a drug and narcotics problem that deeply affects the people of Jordan and areas round about. The Arab states cannot have a situation where all this is going on. That, I think, is driving the reason for them to work with Assad. I'm quite sure a number of them are not working with a glad heart in relation to this, but there are practicalities to protect their people that they have to think of.
So the real politic is that if you want to improve the situation for everyone in that region, you probably have to work with him.
I think, sadly, that is the real politic at the moment. Had you wanted to improve the situation more, maybe that Assad should have gone when the opportunity was there. But no one knows what would have happened if there had been an intervention by the West in 2013. We do know what happened after there was an intervention by Iran and Russia. supported Assad, and he was able to carry on his war against his own people.
And when you step back and look at this in the bigger sense, I mean, you know, is this a sign of the world having changed? That there is no Western-dominated international rules-based order. There is just the world, and people will do what they can and what they can get away with.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think we've moved away from a situation in which states might have looked what would be the reaction of the United Kingdom, what would be the reaction of the US, what would be the reaction of the EU. That's not the situation anymore. Arab states are acting in their own interests for what they think will be right for the region, and they're having to come to terms with what has happened in Syria.
Alistair Burt, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, joining me from Washington, D.C. is Charles Lister, Syria Programme Director at the Middle East Institute think tank. Now, in the US, they're moving in the opposite direction and passing a bill to prevent normalization with Syria. But do you accept that if you're one of Syria's neighbors, the arguments around normalization are different to if you're thousands of miles away?
I think your question is pointing in more or less the right direction, and I think Alistair Burt was very right that regional countries have embraced a kind of realpolitik approach here. So yes, in theory, everyone was going to have to engage the regime in some form in order to push forward some kind of a settlement, a negotiated solution to the Syrian crisis. I think the problem that we've seen in recent weeks is that the engagement has all been one way. The regime has given absolutely nothing, and it has got almost everything it's wanted from the region for the past 12 years. So when we speak about resolving the Syrian crisis, the refugees, the drugs, the terrorism, the insurgency, the corruption, and everything else, the regime has no reason to give on any of those issues. So there's a problem here. The horse has already bolted before we've given any of our asks, or before the region has. So unfortunately, I think there's a great deal to be sceptical about what's likely to be achieved.
Because Saudi Arabia is talking about trying to draw in a wider international coalition to try and improve the situation in Syria. I mean, what do they want to do?
Well, the Saudis, I mean, every country in the region who's engaging in this have their own interests, but the Saudis are particularly concerned about the flow of a drug called Captagon into the country, which is being manufactured on an industrial scale by regime-linked actors. And so they want to see an end put to that drug smuggling effort, which is worth tens of billions of dollars every year. They're concerned, I think, on behalf of other regional partners about the refugee situation. Of course, there are at least 6 million refugees in neighboring countries, and there's a desire to see those Syrian refugees return to Syria and ease the burden that they place on those host governments. But again, as I say, the regime has created the drug problem precisely in order to be able to coerce regional governments to re-engage it. In other words, they have created a fire and they're now offering themselves as the firemen. But at the same time, those drugs are creating an invaluable, irreplaceable income stream for the regime. And likewise, the refugee issue. Refugees are never going to return to a Syria that is controlled by the regime. Every poll that has ever been done of refugee populations has shown less than 0.5% would be ever willing to return to a Syria controlled by the regime. So normalizing the regime is the last thing that we should be doing at this stage if we truly want to resolve the refugee issue. So again, the horse has bolted before we have actually got into a negotiation process.
So the truth is Assad has won again. You know, he won the war and now he's winning the diplomacy.
He has mass murdered himself and utilized every war crime possible in order to survive. And he has created enough problems for his neighbors in order to force them, frankly speaking, to come groveling to his feet. That is certainly how it is seen in Syria these days, is that they have, they reign victorious. And the Iranian president, Raisi, was in Damascus just a couple of weeks ago, and he literally proclaimed victory in the face of their Sunni Arab, rivals, who for years, of course, had sought the overthrow of the regime. So
and I
yes,
guess their
absolutely,
key ally,
Assad stands victorious.
Their key ally, Russia, will take the example.
Yes, so I mean, geopolitically, this is where this is really significant. I mean, war criminals and dictators learn lessons from each other, and Assad has just shown that the age of impunity is a very real thing today. There has been zero justice and accountability when it comes to the regime's crimes, and of course, as far as Putin is concerned, he he kind of resolved or achieved Assad's survival through that 2015 intervention. So when we're looking at Ukraine, there is, frankly, a lot of reason to be very concerned about how much is the international community in this for the long haul. If it's taken 12 years for the West to basically lose interest in trying to resolve the Syrian crisis, how long is it going to take in Ukraine?
Charles Lister, thank you very much.